51 years ago, 15-year-old Janet Commins left Flint Sports Centre in the small Welsh town of Flint, North Wales. Before leaving, she told one of her friends she was going straight home, but she never arrived. 4 days later, 3 children playing near a local primary school made a devastating discovery. Hidden in undergrowth was the body of the missing schoolgirl. The murder of a quiet 15-year-old in a close-knit community stunned the town and triggered one of the largest police investigations North Wales had ever seen. Investigators questioned almost every local young man of a certain age and quickly arrested a suspect. The case appeared to be solved, and for decades the public believed justice had been done. But the investigation concealed a remarkable contradiction. The real killer was never suspected. He remained in Flint, living among the same community that had searched for Janet. He married, raised a family, and watched another man go to prison for the crime committed in his place. The truth survived only because a small piece of forensic evidence collected in 1976 had been carefully preserved. Decades later, advances in DNA science would uncover what the original investigation had missed and expose one of the most significant miscarriages of justice in North Wales. But before we dive deep into this story, please let us know where you are watching from. And if stories like this interest you, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Flint is a small town on the southern bank of the Dee estuary in North Wales, looking across the water toward England's Wirral Peninsula. Overlooking the shoreline are the ruins of Flint Castle, one of the first fortresses built by King Edward I during his conquest of Wales in the 13th century. Although its history stretches back centuries, by the 1970s, Flint was known less for medieval battles than for its steel industry, rows of terraced houses, and a strong sense of community. Many of the town's residents had lived there for generations. Neighbors knew one another, children walked to school together, and families built their lives around the local schools, churches, and factories. It was the kind of place where familiarity brought a sense of security, making serious violent crime seem almost unimaginable. Among those families were Ted and Eileen Commins. Ted had served in the British Army before leaving the military in 1957 to work at the nearby Shotton Steel Works. Eileen was a nurse, and together they raised their only child, Janet, on King Edward Drive. By January 1976, Janet was 15 years old and attended Flint High School. She was described by her family as quiet, shy, and home-loving. She enjoyed swimming at the local sports center and spent much of her free time with a close group of friends. She had never had a boyfriend and was not known for staying out late or wandering far from home. In the privacy of her bedroom, she still played with dolls, reflecting an innocence that made what happened next even more difficult for those who knew her to comprehend. On the afternoon of Wednesday, 7 January 1976, Janet Commins returned home from Flint High School as she normally did. Like many winter evenings, she was looking forward to meeting her friends at Flint Sports Center, where they often went swimming together. Before making any plans, she asked her mother if she could go that evening. Eileen Commins thought her daughter looked unwell. Concerned that she might be coming down with something, she told Janet she should stay home and go swimming the following night instead. Janet did not argue. She accepted her mother's decision and went upstairs to her bedroom. Sometime later, however, she quietly left the house without her parents knowing. Before she went, she left behind a handwritten note explaining that she would be home by 8:30 that evening. She wasn't planning to ignore her mother's wishes completely. Instead of going swimming, she intended only to visit the sports center briefly and tell her friends she would join them the following night. It was a simple change of plans, one that countless teenagers might have made without giving it a second thought. At the sports center, Janet met her friends as intended. There was nothing unusual about the visit. She explained that she would not be swimming that evening, but hoped to see everyone the next day. At around 7:30 p.m., she left the sports center and told one of her friends she was heading straight home. That conversation would become the last confirmed interaction she had with a friend. Her walk home was not a long one. The route took her through familiar parts of Flint, past places she had known for years. There was every reason to believe she would be home within minutes. At approximately 8:10 p.m., another 15-year-old pupil from Flint High School saw Janet near the edge of the school playing fields, close to the footpath leading towards King Edward Drive. The witness later told investigators that Janet appeared relaxed. She was laughing while talking with two boys. One was described as thin and fair-haired. The other appeared slightly older, perhaps around 17 years old. The witness also noticed something else. A shadowy figure stood some distance away near a tree. At the time, it seemed insignificant. There was nothing about the scene that suggested danger, and the witness continued on his way without thinking much about it. Only later, after Janet disappeared, would those few moments become one of the most closely examined sightings in the entire investigation. As the evening wore on, Janet failed to return home. 8:30 came and went, then 9 o'clock. By 10 p.m., it was clear something was wrong. Her father, Ted Commins, immediately began searching for her himself. He walked through the streets of Flint, checking places she was known to visit, and speaking with neighbors in the hope that someone had seen her. Every passing minute increased the urgency, but the search produced no answers. At around 11 p.m., Ted went to the local police station and reported his daughter missing. Police officers began searching Flint, while family members, neighbors, and friends waited anxiously for news. The hours turned into days. No confirmed sightings emerged beyond Janet's last known movements. Despite the growing concern throughout the town, there was still no indication of what had happened after she left the footpath near the school playing fields. Then, on the morning of Sunday, 11 January 1976, the search came to a tragic end. 3 children were playing hide-and-seek near the local primary school when they made a horrifying discovery. Hidden in undergrowth was the body of Janet Commins. Investigators determined that she had been attacked and killed shortly after leaving Flint Sports Center on the evening she disappeared. The location of her body was only a short distance from the route she would have taken home. Forensic specialists carefully examined the scene and collected every piece of evidence they could recover. Among the material preserved were biological samples that, although impossible to fully analyze with the technology available in 1976, would later prove to be of immense importance. At the time, however, no one could have known that. News of the discovery spread quickly through the town. Residents struggled to understand how such a crime could happen in a community where neighbors had known one another for generations. Parents who had once thought little of children walking familiar streets now faced a very different reality. For Ted and Eileen Commins, the search they had desperately hoped would end with Janet's safe return had instead ended in unimaginable loss. During the week following Janet's death, officers interviewed more than 10,000 people. Detectives carried out extensive door-to-door inquiries throughout Flint and the surrounding area, searching for anyone who might have seen Janet or noticed suspicious activity on the evening of 7 January. Every local young man up to the age of 22 was visited and asked to account for his movements that night. Investigators also organized a reconstruction of Janet's final journey. In an act of remarkable determination, her mother, Eileen Commins, took part in the reconstruction herself, hoping it might encourage new witnesses to come forward with information that could explain what had happened to her daughter. Among the many young men questioned during those early weeks was a 16-year-old local boy named Stephen Hough. His grandparents lived in a house overlooking the area where Janet's body had been found. When detectives asked where he had been on the night of the murder, he admitted that he had been stealing petrol from a vehicle elsewhere in Flint. The theft resulted in him being fined, and investigators accepted his explanation for his whereabouts. With that, he was eliminated from the inquiry. No one knew that this routine interview would later become one of the most significant moments in the history of the case. Instead, the investigation soon focused elsewhere. Within days of Janet's body being discovered, police arrested Noel Jones, an 18-year-old scrap metal dealer from the gypsy community. Jones would later describe himself as a young man who could barely read or write. According to his later account, detectives pressured him during questioning and showed him written statements that he was unable to properly understand. He maintained that he was coerced into making a confession and eventually accepted responsibility for a crime he had not committed. During his trial, Jones pleaded guilty to manslaughter. He was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment and ultimately served 6 years before being released. Afterwards, he said the conviction had destroyed his life. He said he had been attacked while in prison and was ostracized by people both inside and outside his community. According to Jones, He had entered the interview room as an illiterate teenager and left carrying responsibility for a murder he had never committed. Janet's uncle, Derek, later said the family had always believed the original investigation had been inadequate. In his view, once Noel Jones had been arrested, detectives were no longer interested in pursuing other possibilities. Officially, the investigation was considered complete. Unofficially, unanswered questions remained. No one felt those unanswered questions more deeply than Janet's father. Ted Commins had served his country, worked for years at Shotton Steel Works, and devoted himself to his family. Following Janet's murder, his health and quality of life steadily declined. Eventually, he spent the final 13 years of his life in a residential care home, unable to communicate properly. Throughout that time, Eileen visited him every day. Ted died before the truth about his daughter's murder was ever uncovered. As the years passed, Flint slowly returned to everyday life. New generations grew up. Familiar faces grew older. The murder that had once dominated headlines gradually became another unsolved chapter in the town's history. Meanwhile, the person truly responsible remained free. By the early 2000s, advances in forensic science were transforming cold case investigations across the United Kingdom, giving detectives new opportunities to examine evidence that had once been beyond the limits of technology. In 2006, 30 years after Janet's death, North Wales Police reopened the case as part of a cold case review. Detectives returned to the evidence collected in January 1976. Among the exhibits were semen samples that forensic scientists had carefully preserved on microscope slides. At the time they were collected, DNA profiling did not exist, yet the decision to preserve those samples with such care meant they had survived for decades. Scientists worked painstakingly to recover a usable DNA profile from the preserved material. They succeeded. The profile was then uploaded to the National DNA Database. The result came back. There was no match. For a moment, the renewed investigation seemed to have reached another dead end. The DNA profile remained on the national database, but there was no one to connect it to. Detectives had the identity of the killer preserved in genetic form, yet they still had no name. Another 10 years passed. Then, in early 2016, an entirely separate criminal investigation unexpectedly changed the course of Janet Commins' case. A man named Hough, now 57 years old, was arrested in connection with the sexual assault of a 15-year-old girl. As part of the routine arrest procedure, officers took a mouth swab to obtain his DNA profile. That profile was entered into the National DNA Database. Almost immediately, the database returned a result. Hough's DNA matched the profile recovered from the evidence collected in Janet Commins' murder investigation. After 4 decades, investigators finally knew whose DNA had been left behind on the night Janet was killed. He was not a stranger who had surfaced years later. He was someone the original investigation had already interviewed. Back in 1976, Hough had been 16 years old. His grandparents' house overlooked the area where Janet's body was eventually found. When detectives questioned him, he claimed he had been stealing petrol elsewhere in Flint that evening. His explanation was accepted, and he was removed from the inquiry. During those decades, Hough had continued living in Flint. He married, had children, and remained part of the same community where Janet had lost her life. While Janet's family lived with unanswered questions, and Noel Jones carried the burden of a wrongful conviction, Hough never came forward. In 2016, North Wales Police arrested Hough and charged him with the rape and murder of Janet Commins. Hough's trial began at Mold Crown Court in 2017. He denied the allegations against him. He even denied knowing Janet Commins. When asked about his movements on the night of 7 January 1976, he repeated the same explanation he had given police 41 years earlier. He said he had been stealing petrol. It was the story that had once convinced investigators to eliminate him from their inquiry. Now it was being examined alongside evidence that had not existed in 1976. One of the most significant witnesses during the trial was Noel Jones. He told the jury that his confession had been false. He said he had signed statements without fully understanding them and had become a convenient suspect because he appeared to fit what investigators were looking for. The jury also heard the forensic evidence. On 13 July 2017, the jury returned its verdicts. Stephen Hough was found guilty of manslaughter, rape, and serious sexual assault. He was found not guilty of murder. According to reports from the courtroom, Hough showed no visible reaction as the verdicts were read. 4 days later, on 17 July 2017, he was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment for the killing of Janet Commins, together with a further 3 years to be served consecutively for the unrelated sexual assault committed in 2016. The total sentence was 15 years imprisonment. Janet's mother, Eileen Commins, was too distressed to attend the sentencing hearing. Instead, Janet's uncle, Derek, read a family statement outside the court. He spoke about the devastating impact Janet's death had on the family, particularly on her parents. The conclusion of Hough's trial also reopened another injustice. Following the conviction, Noel Jones appealed against his 1976 manslaughter conviction. The Court of Appeal heard the case and ruled that Jones had been the victim of a serious miscarriage of justice. His conviction was quashed, and he was fully exonerated of any involvement in Janet Commins' death. North Wales police publicly acknowledged that the wrong man had been convicted in 1976. After more than 4 decades, one family finally had answers, while another man, at last, had his name cleared.